We are officially on. So, welcome everyone. Good morning. It's a wonderful pleasure for me to have Professor Jennifer Scuro today. She is an associate professor of philosophy and interim chair of the philosophy department at Molloy University. Her work spans feminist philosophy, trauma studies, reproductive justice, and graphic medicine. As of this year, earlier books, originally published with Rowman and Littlefield and Lexington Books, are now under Bloomsbury. Recent publications include The Postcolonial and Post-Traumatic Specters and Syndrome of White Feminist Canon, which interrogates the persistence of white feminist canon, and Birth Privilege as White Privilege, 2024, which asks how to reclaim narrative control over when and how to give birth, and how to interrupt dominant narratives of childbirth amid disproportionately high maternal mortality rates among women of color and Black women in the United States. She also has two entries on trauma and on diagnosis, in keywords and key images in graphic medicine with the Penn State University Press. Today, Jennifer is going to present on affective labor and pregnancy loss. This will be part of our international webinar series for No Bump No Care. No Bump No Care is a platform for reproductive rights across people who are in need. Jennifer, thank you too much. Thank you so much for having accepted our invitation today. It's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for the series. Thank you for doing this. I'm glad to be invited to do it. As we were talking before we got on the live stream, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to take this work that I've had in different spots and like pieces of things, and to be able to like put them in a pot and cook them in real time, and find new things and discover new ways in which like the work could be useful, and add some depth to problems that are really important. So what I did was I did a PowerPoint just to kind of give some structure. I'm going to start my timer too, so that way we have it. So if you bear with me, the slideshow has a QR code. So it's available um, on Google Slides to be viewed. So if anybody wants to like follow along the structure, I usually have, I think it's please use with request or permission. So you're more than welcome to take a look. I don't have on here my works cited page. So, but my information's there, and I'm easy to contact if people are interested. And I think what I might do is attack on to the slideshow my works cited when I'm ready, and then that way people can have access to it probably after today, when they're looking at the material separately. So these are the two books. Mostly what I'm going to be discussing today is outcomes from the Pregnancy Equal Childbearing Project. It is a graphic novel that's like an autoethnographic narrative of my pregnancy losses and when I gave birth to children. So I have two children, but mixed in with this very traumatic pregnancy history, and then it's juxtaposed with a full philosophical phenomenological analysis. I was trained as a philosopher, so when a lot of this experience had happened, I had originally done it as a philosophy piece that got rejected from everywhere. And so, yeah, of course, philosophers did not, or at least even feminist philosophers did not quite treat it as a significant subject, as and it was to some degree a peripheral subject. And I ended up years later then doing the graphic novel. And I just happened to have somebody willing to like put them together. And they had said to me what to do to bridge them, because putting that in the same volume seems so disproportionate. And we ended up doing a kind of like the Oreo cookie. The nice middle piece was basically that the story that I had that was very intimate and personal, and particular to me, was only allegory to maybe things that I thought were really important. So some of what I'll be doing today is the final chapter is on grief work and this idea of like there was a kind of work through grief that I was doing. I was mourning a death that wasn't quite a death, and I was finding that with all that I had been through, a lot of that silence, that lack of language was the most disorienting going through that. And my Addressing Ableism book, I'm going to talk partially about that because what I discovered, or at least what I argued, is that ableism is a dismembering phenomenon, and what I've been arguing since the publication is that strategies of enmemberment, not quite remembering, but enmembering, are ways in which we kind of resist or confront ableism in all its kind of like very many forms. And
Mm,
so that's the basically where the work is going to come in to kind of cook in this special pot today and hopefully provide something really substantial. So I broke down affective labors, or at least what I'm thinking of when I think of affective labor, as I'm naming it, is there are existential labors, labors of objects and orientations. There's labors against social emotional demands. There are labors from the loss of sense or rebuilding intuitions. And then there's laboring for solidarity. And one of the things that I think really came from the pregnancy project was when you are pregnant and you give birth, the baby is our baby, right? So it's not, it's a shared thing, it's a public thing. People feel entitled to have some claim over the baby in a way that is shared. But when you miscarry and you have pregnancy loss, the loss is your own, right? So that you carry that burden in a way that's so privatized and silenced that even when I did the graphic novel and I published it, people began to share with me
mm,
their losses and almost like we found each other and I had like built a network of people. So, in thinking of affect theory as a resource, phenomenology is what I was doing, or I called it semi-phenomenology because I didn't really want to overcommit myself to like doing proper phenomenology. So I said semi-phenomenology was what I was doing with the pregnancy project. But since then, especially because now I've gravitated more toward trauma theory and trauma work, especially as trauma intersects with disability, I'm finding that affect theory is a fantastic resource. And so I go back to some of the affect theory models that I've always found such so helpful to me in my mind. Teresa Brennan's The Transmission of Affect is one. She is more psychotherapeutic. She uses psychoanalytic tools. I don't really quite like she talks about energetics. Not as helpful to me. I've always had a little bit of like it did not I couldn't latch on to it the same
mm,
kind of way, but she did talk about how energy and affect drive an object, provide these interrelations. And what I always liked is how she described affect as this kind of like environmental energetics that you end up absorbing and also kind of ejecting or dispelling, right? In some ways, discharging.
mm.
When I did my ableism project, I talked about how ableism is like a hot potato, and like you get ableism, and then you kind of like hot potato it to someone else. So I always thought affect theory, the via Brennan's work was kind of like how I came up with the hot potato problem of ableism. So part of the kind of escalation of pregnancy loss is that when we are in the world, we are already being in the world and engaged in the world, a pregnancy loss, miscarriage, particularly can de-world us. We get kicked out of the world. The world suddenly becomes this like disconnect takes place. And I talk about that in the grief work piece. It's like the work of grief work, all the labor is this reworlding myself, putting myself and trying to like normalize maybe stuff that and a lot of it was masking and cover up, but it really was to kind of like rehook onto the world in some way that prevented it from constantly being this kind of like corrosive alienation. And then in that same way, in the ableism book, where she talks about that transmission or transference, this isn't just emotional labor. I think a lot of the therapeutics and the service professions, when they talk about disability or they talk about trauma, what I've found is a lot of them want to resolve. They want to have like a model for progress. They want to get to somewhere. And I think that's what I'm learning is that like the more there are these kinds of models of like resilience or things like that, the more salty I get because I think that we don't treat trauma experience and trauma survivorship as a knowledge of which already has value. We're always moving the survivor into like a place in which they have to like convert that into something useful.
Mhm.
And so the emotional labor, I think you know, that I'm doing emotional work, I have that as part of it, but affect theory helps me cover the depth of how one is affected by trauma, by something like a pregnancy loss that has like there's so much work that's going on. It's not just about me getting my emotional state into something more familiar or more comfortable. So the somatophobia in the ableism book is what starts a lot of the project about ableism is that it's a Western somatophobia. We have this like problem with the body. We really are always trying to control it. We have this gap between the mind and the body, mind over matter, willpower. You know, it's so misogynist. And of course, the bias is, as I've argued it, is that it's a dismembering thing. It does what it does is it takes people apart, takes communities apart. So ableism, especially disability bias, can be so life-threatening. I think that's always what I've emphasized with a lot of my students is that ableism isn't just like bad words or isn't it just about awareness of disabilities. It really can be where some lives are considered disposable. And I think that's where I've been working really hard to say whatever it is to resist ableism or to confront ableism is a special kind of labor. And even just identifying ableism is a special labor. To identify ableism is a labor, and then to resist ableism is another labor, and then to confront it, another labor again. So the multi levels of kind of like the kind of work it takes to member oneself against the dismemberments of ableism is kind of what I've been doing with my book and the kind of argument I've made since. So, in talking about affective labors, these dimensions, the first one, of course, is this existential labor. And very recently, Lucy O'Donnell, who's an artist who I actually have a piece here, it's lovely. We've been working together for a while now. She had um, done an exhibition called Our Little Earthbound Tales, and the catalog she brought in a bunch of us who are working in kind of infertility, pregnancy loss artists, writers, and had us. She curated basically a collection of essays, and I wrote a piece called Ilya. And in that piece, I talked about it's a idea from Emmanuel Levinas, where um, in talking about his existential theory, he said there's this like dull hum of existence that is the terror of being without a face, right? It's like this idea that there's like this nothingness. And again, writing against Heidegger, the Ilia for me when I had my pregnancy loss really was this kind of meaninglessness of the everyday that became that life-threatening part of the loss and the grief you experience after that. You somehow have to get back to things, that you have to like get over it and move on. The Ilia was the kind of blankness of the walls that you stare at when in your room and the despair that comes. So I had borrowed a little of Sisu. She resists death, so she makes trouble. So as long as I kept myself going, as much as I really at that point probably was not well, and I didn't do it, but the content warning here is I'm probably with pregnancy loss going to be discussing suicide, suicidality, um, rape, sexual assault, because all of these things come into the kind of affective labor that's maybe at the periphery of something that we might share when we talk about something like pregnancy loss. And in this case, I really was very often just keeping myself in the world enough so that I was not like giving up. Again, the despair of the deworlding of that kind of falling apart was probably some of the hardest work I had to do. And again, as a kind of affective labor, the depth of the affect made anything I was doing this attempt to kind of challenge something that I had no language for. It wasn't really just a therapeutic kind. It wasn't. I could not uptalk myself out of it. And so the so I think what was the line I wrote was something like, "What is hidden in the crush of the Ilia was what all that work, all that labor was doing." Was kind of trying to labor against that. Okay, so B, the labors of objects and orientations. When I thought about this, again, Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology, very helpful. She does affect theory in a way that's super, super helpful. Um, and talks about it in relation to orientation, disorientation, and the queerness of things, right? So, a commentator and affect theory reader says in this piece called Why This, says
Mm.
with Ahmed's work, orientation points toward the unfolding of worlds and tendencies. Bodies and spaces are shaped by the material affective encounters. And Ahmed in queer phenomenology says, moments of disorientation are vital. To make things queer is to disturb the order of things. So I kept thinking of the kind of work it takes that in the wake of a loss, you'd have to like break down the crib. That was the kind of level of affective labor that I was thinking of because a lot of the discussion in Ahmed was that we have these affections for objects that can be that look to others as if they are sentimental or disproportional, a pair of booties, a smell, again, a piece of furniture. They take on these kinds of very strange totem-like qualities in pregnancy loss because there's no other way to orient oneself or reorient oneself when one has been kind of thrown out of the world through the loss. Again,
Mm.
there's no markers. So, how do we kind of mark the world in a way that reorients the labor that occurs when things are so disoriented? So, I do think that there is an important epistemic labor in this kind of work of like reconfiguring objects. Um, One of the things that Lucy and I did is we have a podcast recording that has to be edited. We're going to work on that where we did talk about the production of and reproduction of kind of artwork. How do you make art after a pregnancy loss? Like how do you talk about, creating after something like that? And what kind of objects do we make? Like how the disoriented and disorientations are sites of possible creative activity was one of the things we talked about in the podcast coming. So and I do think this is also where the resilience models of trauma theory and trauma therapies are particularly problematic. I do think that people fixating on things or trying to find spaces in which they could breathe or reorient, I think that has more potential because again, the idea here is that it's a special kind of labor. I think we erase that potential labor when we're trying to get people to be moving on, right? To get back into the world as it already is, as if the important thing is to maintain orientation, to get back in line. Some of the stuff that Ahmed does is talk about like how when you announce yourself as queer to your family, how you disappoint the father and the question of reproduct, like you got to get back into line, you got to straighten up, right? And again, even being straight is so important to that like reproductive impulse to like keep the family line. Really great like narrative to adapt and to see if maybe it could recover these kind of hidden labors of trying to not just go back into the world as if it were like to get back into line. The labor against life-threatening social emotional demands. I don't have text here because a lot of this stuff is quite familiar. Um, in many of our personal experiences of pregnancy loss or um, when we're with people who have experienced pregnancy loss, when we're the partners or the people around someone who experiences pregnancy loss. What I found was that part of my job in surviving this was to somehow let my family know that I'm doing okay, right? The despair on their faces, the worry, the anger that my father experienced was something that I was expected to manage, which was really difficult for me at the time because I was barely surviving, and yet their frustrations, their rage, their anxieties was also somehow my
Mhm.
responsibility. And again, the affective transfer and transmission was extremely burdensome. I couldn't be responsible. My husband had to like take care of my child while I was trying to recover, or at least while I was trying to like survive in a way that when it came time to like really, connect back up, we had to sit down and talk about whether or not we could be together again because and to stay married because in some ways he was grieving my death. He basically had to like carry on without me.
Mhm.
So, the affect of the event on him was this kind of, and there have been studies on this too, that partners of people who have experienced pregnancy loss tend to like have a delay on their grief in a way that you might be prioritizing the grief in the immediate sense, but we're not really dealing or grappling with that grief when it comes to the people who are surrounding that person. And again, that's where affect theory does things that are not. The other images here is me trying to parent my child, coming back to that and being super disoriented and knowing that she also was affected by this kind of disconnect, this kind of loss of affective attention from her parent. We still talk about that there's some imprinted um, memory with my child on that, like to this day, I think. In therapy, the therapist constantly telling me that I was over intellectualizing. I wasn't grieving properly, which was like,
Okay.
I'm doing the best I can, but I had to go back to work. Like, I had to go back to work in a way that, like, if I had a death of a family member, I think I would have had more time and it would have been more recognized. But because of the pregnancy loss, the going back to work part, the social emotional demands that were around me were like
Mhm.
just they were so corrosive to my all the work I'm doing to keep myself alive, and it's almost like here, but do some more, do some more. let's really make you let's make you earn it, to get back into the world. And of course the image there at the bottom of what looks like a very nice elderly lady was in fact because my one of my miscarriages had to be completed with a D&E procedure in a clinic. As I left the clinic, there was a woman standing outside and she came over to me and she was very sweet. She held the door open for me. And then she says to me, "What you do hurts all of us," because I was outside of what's considered an abortion clinic and she was protesting. So
Mhm.
what came across as this very sweet, so her affect was very motherly and maternal and nurturing. But what she said to me was as if she was shouting, hurling insults in my face. It was so humiliating. I was so traumatized by that. To be honest, I ended up writing a whole article, a whole chapter in a book just on the confrontation of women against women. Like that
Wait,
moment.
Jennifer, can I stop you there? I
Yeah.
don't know what did she have wrong against you? What was her problem?
Well, what happened was, again, it was a reproductive clinic. It was like an abortion clinic and reproductive care clinic where I had the procedure done because I couldn't
Mm,
have it done in a hospital. There was a specialty that only someone who does abortive procedures, D&Es, was able to do. So I had gone to that place to
mhm.
terminate what was left of the pregnancy that was going to kill me. And in that pregnancy, and this is all narrated in the story, I was there not because I was intentionally
Mhm,
terminating, but because that was the only person that could do what I needed to save my
mhm.
life. And when I went to walk out, because I could walk out, it was an outpatient procedure. When I went to walk out, she was protesting. And so she was basically talking to whoever was going in and out in a
Ah,
pro-life
so
protest.
everyone, not just you. Okay.
Not just me, but when I came out, she
Hmm.
came to open the door and I thought it was someone being nice. I had no idea. And then she
Wow.
very quietly and gently says,
Mhm.
"What you do hurts all of us." And so that social emotional demand on me that somehow I was doing something that is immoral or
Wow.
something that is in the context of a like a political like as if I was murdering, like again on that and not knowing any context, there was no defense. I was actually just a raw nerve, and very vulnerable at that moment because of a political ideology, because of a politics. And what I thought and what was important about the affective quality, the affective labor, was she did it in a way that was kind and nurturing while
Mm.
saying something that was life-threatening and traumatizing. So it sounded like she was yelling it at me, but she had actually come over and very gently said it to me. So the affect was complete put on, right? It was an affectation meant to seduce me into thinking she was going to be kind when she was cruel.
Wow.
So that kind of stuff, and again, the kind of stuff that would happen, that labor, it literally felt like dodgeball. I was constantly, people would say things to me in the court like, "Oh, are you going to try again?" Well, at least you could, at least you know you can have children. Like, is that
Wow.
supposed to be nice? Like the demands of that society and what they think I should be like wanting or how I should be feeling was an assault on every bit of my body and every bit of my emotional well-being. So and then the labors of sense, right, out of the sense of things. This one I had to really think about how I wanted to put this together, but I think it has to do with the fact that like the body betrayal that comes with pregnancy is really complex. And like when I had the pregnancy loss, I was about halfway through my pregnancy. So I was no longer pregnant, but looked pregnant. And I literally couldn't wear any clothes. I didn't know how to leave the house. Even when you are pregnant, the way your body's moved around, the way your body is, you know, kind of, if, there's all that extra emotion of feeling like you have a parasite that like, and in some senses that pregnancy that I had was going to kill me.
Mm.
And the loss of that sense, that intuition of knowing my own body or feeling even pleasure about myself, about my body, about my being able to enjoy a piece of cake, like all of that was out the window. And I remember having to, my daughter's birthday was about 2 weeks after the loss, and I had to bake a cake.
Oh.
And I'm sitting there all like bloated and trying to bake a cake, and it was a fantastic cake. I really threw myself into it, but the numbness underneath that, that loss of like that intuition of my body knowledge, of my ability to be sensual, to sense things, to feel, was gone. And I had to kind of like learn, trick myself back into enjoying my body again. I remember going for a run or a long walk and getting about 2 miles in and sobbing just because my
Oh.
body was discharging
Ah.
all of the energy. When I was about what I was traveling and I broke out into a rash. And my husband looked at me and he says, I think this would have been the time when you would have had the baby. So I think my body was scripting out a kind of script for itself of like what was supposed to happen. And of course, I broke out into this rash at that 9 month, what would have been that 9 month mark. And it was really humbling because I was like, oh, I didn't even know my body was doing these things. I didn't even remember what that was. I had kind of disconnected from my body completely. Our bodies being fat, our bodies being weird and disturbing and odd. I think one of the things that I'm finding really important, especially in trauma work too, is re-narrating what the body is, re-narrating pleasure back into one's story. And so I used Susan Bryson's, obviously Kate Mann's here, but I used Susan Bryson's Aftermath, Violence and the Remaking of the Self for this because she talks about this idea that narrative facilitates the ability to go on. And very recently, I guess, I want to say maybe in the past couple of years or something, um, Simon Critchley for the New York Times philosopher wrote about how, God, what did he call it? Um, he said, life doesn't need a narrative arc. he basically argues that like stop making life about narrative. Like not everybody needs their life to be a story. And it's this really a super condescending description. I almost want to quote it. Can I quote it? Do I have like 2 minutes
Of course,
left?
go
I
ahead.
so want to do it because I found this to be um, I found this to be typical of someone who does not like pregnancy loss gives a special like way of
Mhm,
seeing this as being very naive, a kind of claim. Life doesn't need a narrative arc. We don't have to be the stories we endlessly tell and retell about ourselves. Those stories are fabulation, and if told too often, falsification. The more gusto with which we tell our stories, we further risk slipping from the truth. One doesn't have control of one's sense of self by constantly tying it back to some fictional story of identity. And I think what Bryson does instead, especially after having been raped, was to defend the need for that reclaimed narrative
mhm,
over, and again, you think of people who have been assaulted or have been victimized being able to testify to what happened. Again, we are surrounded by a culture that is comfortable with the gaslighting of women as to their own, or being able to testify to their own experiences. And even she says the degree of moral gaslighting that occurs in our society makes it that we aren't even good witnesses for ourselves. So she says there, not just that we become unreliable, we become treacherous as narrators. And
mhm,
so I think, thinking of women or like believe women or the testimonies of women, I think prioritizing that becomes a really important kind of acknowledgement or honoring of effective labor.
mhm,
And I know that when it came to the case of Ireland overturning the Eighth Amendment, I think it was the stories of the women in her shoes campaign, where women told their stories about their experiences that made a big difference. Um, and so then finally, the idea of laboring for solidarity, this was the goal of the Pregnancy Project at the end, is that no matter whether you have a baby or you don't have a baby, or you had a miscarriage or you had an abortion, like whatever relation that one has to pregnancy, especially for those, though, who have been pregnant, that there would be a kind of solidarity possible. And the only piece I found since then that I love and I keep coming back to is Alison Spurgis's Solidarity in Falling Apart toward a crip collectivist and justice-seeking theory of feminine fracture. So that as we're falling apart, that's the basis of our solidarity. I think solidarity is like we're all in it together. And I think when it comes to pregnancy loss, it is so dismembering. It is so deworlding. And there's so much labor just trying to get ourselves into enmembering spaces and reorienting ourselves and kind of reworlding ourselves. So I think the concept of all that labor that one does in the wake of something like a death that's not a death is a possible site of solidarity, if that's even possible. And I think one of the outcomes of this, in thinking of this today, is that um, you can experience this kind of affective labor, any of these and all of these dimensions, without having suffering a loss. So I think even pregnancy begets all of this labor anyway, that you don't have to go through pregnancy loss to know this labor as life-threatening labor. Postpartum, you'll go through many versions of this kind of labor. So I think pregnancy begets these labors in a way that you don't have to know pregnancy loss to know the labor. So that would be kind of kind of my offering for everybody today. Um, yeah, I think how did I do on my time?
absolutely well. Thank you.
Good, good.
Thank you so much.
I can stop
That's
sharing.
yeah, lots to process, and it's a very rich talk. Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's beautiful, touching, and thought-provoking.
Good.
Yeah, I wouldn't, I don't know from where to begin.
Mm,
Uh, from the silence, maybe.
mm,
You spoke about the silence, so which leads us back to the narrative. I mean, probably people who don't need a narrative, narratives can
hmm
minimize the utility that they have in our lives. Because I mean, this is happening in your body. Your body remembered when the 9 month arrived,
Mm,
when things happened, and you need to keep up with it.
mm,
And we don't have words. Um, so I don't know what kind of, I don't know if you have advice or uh, ideas to share with people who might listen to us. They are not expert in philosophy, they are not nurses, but they, it's something that touch all of us one way
mm,
or another, whether it's with the pregnancy or, as you said, with anything in life that requires affective work. How can we find the words that break the silence in a way that is sensitive, in a way that is understanding? Because we
mm,
know the limits of, oh, at least you know that you can have children, or, yeah, okay, you
mm,
survived, you have your daughter anyway, you know, and probably all these people are well meant in
mm,
saying this. How can we grow up? What do you
mm.
think?
I think that, well, I think that's tough because, again, philosophy, it's never been very helpful.
No.
Philosophers tend to give terrible advice, hence the comment on the New York Times article there. I do think, Kate Mann's work has been really helpful too, because it's been more diagnostic than it has been like prognostic, right? It's not trying to tell me what I should do or tell us what we could do. But I do think in trying to describe the scope of the complexity of it, we can't cut to the chase and get to the end of the story, right? We can't like get to the other side quickly.
Mhm,
Grieving is inefficient, right? Grieving is, and it's not a there is no arc in that sense, right? There is no like other side of it. I think as I've talked to people about, especially with Lucy O'Donnell, about this as she produces these art pieces, is there is
beautiful,
this
really
kind of
beautiful.
interesting re reproductive activity of like repetitive, repeat, collect. This She does collage work in the art that she does, and I think I've read people who have like done nothing but knitting after a pregnancy
Ah,
loss,
uh-huh.
right? That there's something about this kind of retooling. I think in like trauma therapy, there's been the EMDR has been reported somewhat successful of these kinds of like physical, sensual, tactile kind of almost like re-regulating activities that are meaningful because of the visceral quality, the real
Mm,
like body, mind, molecular level affect, right? It's like so to be so deeply wounded
mhm,
that one might not survive isn't simply a stitch and fix, right? We can't simply like a surgeon come in and do the job. The healing work, whatever that looks like, is
right.
still going to always be never again as before. Like you're never going to go back. And that's always what I had said too in the book, that I think we don't treat this as a knowledge. So when I think of like what to do, I think it's crafting ways to reframe or reorient the queerness of those disorientations, right? Thinking of Amit. So when I was thinking how fat I was and how this body is a survivor's body, I began to reorganize it into, but this is my grandmother's body. My grandmother looked like this. And I
Mhm,
was like, wait, but being in my grandmother's body gives me a better sense of place to love my body, to
mhm,
enjoy this body that I have, and not trying to get back to like where I don't look pregnant or where I don't look like this anymore. I don't look like a survivor. I don't look like I physically carry my trauma, which for a lot of trauma survivors, including pregnancy loss survivors, I think you carry that with you in a way that is not, there's no return
mm.
on that labor. You don't get anything back and you don't recover anything. I think that's why I want to be very I want to kind of label what the labor looks like because the labor is not productive labor. It is not observable labor.
Mm,
It tends to be where someone being numb from an experience is labor. That numbness is hard work because it looks like no work. It looks like nothing's happening, right?
mm,
So I think it's not so much advice about how to be sensitive, but it is more like finding ways to acknowledge what kind of labor it takes to survive things that are, in all of fact, unsurvivable, things
mm.
that are unthinkable. That's why pregnant women don't like to talk about pregnancy loss. But I've argued over and over again, every pregnancy is threatened with a loss, right?
Oh,
Every
yeah.
pregnancy has the potential to be a miscarry.
Mm,
And I think I call it an expellation. Every pregnancy expels. And so
mm,
there's no dressing that up. There's no package we could put that in. It is
mm,
not to be contained. And so I think the language betrays us, even when we mean well, to kind of say things that could be helpful. I do think that that's where solidarity is a word that is more helpful, is finding ways to sit with the
mhm,
one who's laboring in a way that can help dispel the labor, to discharge the labor. Um, like acknowledging that when someone's numb, that they are working, that it isn't nothing, it is something.
mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, they are
that would be
work.
my that would be my thought on it. Yeah, and I think the tenderness, the affection that you have for someone who is suffering, who feels like their worst self, who does not feel like they can keep going, I think that too is like, I think that's what kept me going in a lot of ways too. When I went through it, was there were people who were just willing to let me be ugly and despair
Mm.
and process and not get over it. I wasn't getting over it. I wasn't going to get over it. And they were like, okay, all right, we'll hear the story again. We'll hear you again. They were willing to field all of it. And you end up sabotaging your ability to engage in the world because it could be so dangerous to be in that position. The work is that hard.
I think you found something really wise to say, despite us being philosophers. I
I
think
know, I know.
you put your
I'm doing I'm trying. I'm telling you, when I read Critchley's piece, I just felt like it really went after a couple of really thoughtful feminist theorists and philosophers who've been working really hard to say when women come to write and to tell stories, they are already treated as non-credible and as if they need to be tested for the veracity of what they have to say, and
Mm.
not we are not seen as the wise women that we are, in a way that I think is yeah, enraging. Makes me mad.
Yeah. Completely, yeah. And I think you said something that it's universal here. I mean, I think it's valid not just for women who just experience pregnancy loss, but anybody who went through a trauma. I mean, if yeah, if you imagine a family system where one of the member went through a trauma, you need to make space for things to be ugly, for having a person working in a direction that doesn't seem to be work, but it is. I mean, love being there, just
Mm,
yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
And I think I've found some really lovely resources in Adrienne Marie Brown's pleasure the pleasure principle. Wait, where is it? Pleasure activism. That's it. Up there on my shelf. The pleasure activism stuff's been really great
ah,
too, because I think the idea of women always delaying pleasure or feeling like they need to earn pleasure and desire.
mm,
Again, a misogynist society. Kate Mann's done a great job of diagnosing and kind of scoping that out. uh I think that's one that I've seen that has been really interesting, is like to be able to like enjoy the present or the moment and kind of lift off kind of the expectations that have failed, the
mhm.
failures in responsibilities, right? So like all the things that really kind of make that labor um especially taxing and yet not valuable, not considered important, honorable labor, right? Like we're expected to just move on. But I think when we think of pleasure, we think of like that idea of like a little bit of joy or a little bit of like even sexuality being kind of like how do I find myself enjoying my being in the world again? And I think
Yeah.
that's kind of also a part of a recovery project that isn't psychotherapeutic. Again, it's not just emotional labor I'm talking about. I'm trying to
Hmm.
think of the existential, the social emotional, the object orientation model of reclaiming from that loss the kind of demand that that labor be protected, that labor be that labor be supported, and that we distribute the labor whenever possible so that no one survivor is responsible for their survival.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Taking pleasure seriously
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
working toward that without feeling guilty. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's quite a work, but it's a beautiful direction to
Yeah.
take.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's still a work in progress, but like I said, the trying to bring it together and working on trauma too, and not as a therapist, not as somebody who's trained
Right.
in the traditional models of therapy. I
May
think,
I ask,
yeah.
sorry, may I ask what was your breakthrough when you felt, things are changing here? I didn't realize it. I was getting out of this blob, but I'm out,
Mm.
or I'm getting out.
The graphic novel
Mm,
did do something
mhm,
different because I did not realize how much I had a catalog of snapshot memories
mhm.
that when I saw somebody, there were students doing a graphic novel project, and I was like, I'm not a graphic novelist. But
It's
suddenly I just
fantastic.
sat and just unloaded all of these
Uh-huh.
images, partial sketches with pencil. And I didn't really go back and verify anything too. I'd go a couple pages and then I'd call my husband over and be like, what do you think of that? And he goes, oh, that looks right. I remember that. So it was like, that was the only verification. And I just kept going.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, they really weren't going to see the light, but I think it wasn't just that. I mean, it was interesting to unload it, but it was when it was published, and then with the Art of Infertility, they had done a show, and I think it was in Philly, and shout out to Maria Novotny, who is one of the people who had put together the project that ended up being a book. It's called Infertilities, the Art of Infertility, I think, and they have a curated book now. And we went to an art show, and my work was on the wall. The actual original
Oh,
sketches
wow.
were put
I
onto
saw
frames,
that.
and there was um, a they had a rabbi there that sang like as if it were a ceremony, I believe, like like to honor the dead, like kind of,
Oh,
and it
beautiful.
that that was the shift because I
Mm,
didn't have any rituals. There was nothing external. There was no marked grave. I had no I had done a lot of stuff before that to try to like contain it and put it someplace and have it be in my head, right? But it was the moment I was in a situation where I had done enough to kind of externalize the memory so it wasn't creating this havoc in my system like a pinball machine, like all these memories that would
right.
pop out, right? Associations with things that would pop out at any time. Going
Hmm.
past the old doctor's office
Hmm.
would just
Yeah.
have me in tears. Like it was
Mm-hmm.
random associations. Once I had them in and out away from me, and then even up on the wall, in some ways
Wow.
reframing them,
Mm.
I was no longer it was no longer made precarious by them. I was no longer vulnerable to the threat of them being weaponized or used against me, or
Mhm.
somewhere in the world them popping out. Because when you go through loss, it could be years and years later, and suddenly something sets it back, and you're right back there. Especially for trauma survivors,
Mm.
you could go right physically back into those experiences because the body will make that decision for you.
Yeah.
And so I don't think there was the blobbiness of it. Yeah, I like that word. The blobbiness of it was definitely, I think that's why I like this idea of narrative as a strategy of enmemberment, right? Re-narrating is an
Mhm,
enmemberment. I'm able to enmember myself back. I'm not remembering, but I'm enmembering. So I'm able to kind of come back into the world in a way that I can hold space for myself and I can hold space for others without being kind of continually victimized by that being thrown out of the world part. And then yeah, and I think the that work of remembering or reworlding myself, putting myself back in the world, is this idea that like once that was out there, it became useful for others, also
mhm.
uplifted. I one of the questions I asked is how do you get over what you cannot get over? That was the question I
Good
asked.
question.
And there was at a book talk a woman who came with her family and who had suffered a loss. And she was not okay. She was not, and she looked and she says, "Why should I keep going?" And,
Mhm.
and again, not a therapist, not really able. And I looked at her and I said, "Because you asked the question."
Mm,
It's just
mhm.
when you ask that question, it is because you want the hook back in. You
That's a
want
good point.
to, there's some element of the beginning of a desire to be in the world that is not, all is not lost in that sense, as long as you ask that question. If you
Mhm,
ask, how do I get over what I can't get over? You're already laboring in a
mhm.
way that we should be really protective of you for whatever you do next. I That answer the question. I can't answer that question, but I think by asking that question or at least articulating the question, that's the beginning of the life raft being thrown.
Completely. I agree.
Yeah, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for
You're welcome.
this wonderful talk. It's not just academics, it's human. I don't know, it's a message for
I hope so.
everyone around us. So I'm very, very grateful that you took this time today to share it with us.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was nice to be able to talk about this stuff too, because I think when you talk about miscarriage and pregnancy loss, is not a lot of venues, not a lot of people want to have
Yeah.
conversations. It's not an ordinary, coffee talk
One out of
time.
three women. So why? I
I
mean,
know, I know, I
chances
know,
are that when you speak about marriage, miscarriages and pregnancy loss, you are talking to someone who experienced this.
I know, I know. So I thank you so much for providing a little bit of a venue and that I could put these pieces together and be able to think through it again. This also does the work of a kind of uplift out of the trench of, knowing that survivorship is for the rest of my life, right?
Hopefully, yeah, yeah, because we become something. I mean, it's a transformation, like
Right,
one of the
right.
many life put us through.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Thank you
we
so
carry.
much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I hope you can rest and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Thank you.
And
Appreciate
see
it.
you soon,
Okay.
hopefully. Ciao.
Thank you.